So, Commissioner Bush, thank you for joining us today. I wanted to start off by asking about your campaign. You're advancing to the runoff primary election for Attorney General. What part of your message do you think resonated most with voters in the first part of this election?
Well, thank you, Matthew, for inviting me to talk about what is, I believe, the most important race in the state of Texas, and that's regarding our top law enforcement official. You know, I think it comes down to border security and restoring law and order on the streets of Texas. The fact that I was endorsed by the National Border Patrol Council, the union that represents the agents that keep the watch on our southern Texas border, in addition to over 50 law enforcement organizations and leaders, including sheriffs and deputies and constables, that know that I'm going to be tough on crime, that I'm going to work with judges to enhance criminal sentencing. I'm going to work with the legislature to pass a law enforcement bill of rights, which we do not have in the state of Texas. 14 other states do. And that we need to create communities where parents like myself with 2 kids feel safe in raising their kids in our communities. And unfortunately, in short order, it's cities like Houston now that are looking at exceeding any other city in North America as far as homicides this year. So Texas has got to turn things around, and this race is what it's all about.
And so you're facing a bit of an uphill battle here. In the primary, you received 22% of the vote compared to your opponent's 42%. How do you plan to convert some of those voters or reach out to those who didn't vote for either of you in the first round of this primary?
So on March 2, the day after the primary, I reached out to the justice and to the congressmen asking for their support. And we will be continuing to reach out to all of their supporters. And the feedback has been positive. And I say that, Matthew, because the math is pretty simple, that close to 60% voted against the incumbent. So if we can get their supporters or even just a fraction of their supporters, we feel good about where we are. Also, don't take it from me, take it from the Dallas Morning News, which shows that most of our support is strong, or at least that's how it was described by the pollsters, whereas Ken's support is slight. So we feel that as we continue to run a grassroots retail campaign throughout Texas, that Republicans are going to come together and say, look, if we nominate Ken again with the prospect of indictments on bribery corruption charges, that we could very well lose to a Democrat, which would be the first time in over 30 years. And we can't afford that liability and that risk.
So you believe that you stand a better chance of winning in the general election than Ken Paxton?
Totally. And I point voters' attention toward 2014, where I was the top vote getter in the general election against Democrats. In 2018, I was the second highest vote getter. And that same year, Ken Paxton was the lowest vote getter, and he barely beat a plaintiff's attorney, open border, defund the police Democrat by a little over 1%, even though he outspent the Democrat over 2-1. This time around, with bribery corruption charges hanging over his head, an extramarital affair, and the list goes on in terms of his transgressions and his abuse of office, I guarantee he will lose. Again, going back to the data, he underperformed the governor 4 years ago by 10%. And this time around, Beto is probably within 7% of the governor right now. He is already underwater. I perform right there with the governor year in, year out. So my message to Republican registered voters is, look, why take that risk? Let's hit the reset button, go with a proven vote getter who can beat Democrats in the fall.
So if you have to litigate a case against Ken Paxton here, what's your best argument against him other than that you're a better choice in the general election?
Well, when you look at the actual statutory responsibility for our attorney general in the state of Texas, you are known as the top law enforcement official, both in civil and criminal law. And as an indicted felon in Texas, you can't purchase a firearm, you can't sit on a jury, you can't wear the uniform of a law enforcement official. And so my message has been pretty clear that we need somebody who has unimpeachable credentials, somebody who's above reproach, focused on the job, is going to serve Texans on the 3 most important issues that are confronting us, and that's border insecurity. I'm the only candidate in this race, as I mentioned, endorsed by the union that has scrubbed and actually provided input to my plan to secure the border. Law enforcement confronting that issue where morale is extraordinarily low in addition to recruiting, and we need somebody that can look in the eyes of fellow law enforcement. As a military veteran myself who served in Afghanistan and also with experience in confronting transnational gangs and bloody drug cartels and working to designate them as terrorist organizations. And then taking on accountability. And it's hard to be the chief accountability officer for the state of Texas, over 30 million people, if he is facing such legal issues, 3 felony counts, and now an FBI investigation. I want to take on voting fraud, and I want to take on county DAs that refuse to do their job in prosecuting cases. So that's going to require somebody new to hit that reset button and restore trust with the legislature.
And so what's your legal philosophy, and how are you going to advocate for the constitutional rights of Texans?
So I'm a Federalist. I believe in the strength of the 10th Amendment. I don't believe that the Supreme Court, that is, has addressed what I view to be the foundation for our Bill of Rights and, frankly, for the Constitution, to allow states like Texas to chart its own course. And that's been one of my biggest criticisms on Ken, is that he has lost the big seminal cases that allow for Texans to design their own future, whether it was losing to California on Obamacare, losing a conservative speech protection bill that passed through the legislature this session, losing in the federal district court there, or losing on behalf of President Trump on election integrity before the Supreme Court. So we need somebody that's going to get the best Solicitor General. I'm going to find the next Ted Cruz to serve as our Solicitor General for the state of Texas, take on our appellate arguments in federal and state courts. And I'm going to recruit the best and brightest, not only from Texas, but throughout the country. On day 1, I'll be suing Joe Biden. Day 2, I'll be doing the same thing. And I think you know what I'm going to be doing day 3. I'm going to be a fighter, a warrior, but somebody, most importantly, Matthew, who's going to actually win, not just somebody who's filing lawsuits. Any lawyer can file a lawsuit in any court, but we need somebody who's actually building a team that can win.
So you sort of got to my next question there, but what would be your first priority and your first action if elected Texas Attorney General?
Well, it's the combination of not only confronting the overreach of the Biden administration. So I've talked about my lawsuit currently pending in a federal court in the Southern District of Texas under the National Impoundment Control Act to compel the federal government to spend the money that was appropriated during the Trump days to finish 300 miles of additional wall. Article 1 in the Constitution is pretty clear that Congress contains the power of the purse, and that under Article 2, the president does not have the authority to overlook prior appropriations, but that's exactly what Joe Biden has done. So I would continue that lawsuit. I think it's the most important suit that the state of Texas is currently involved with in the court. But I think to your point, Matthew, as well, is making sure that we're recruiting the talent that has now left this office. People forget that the top 8 executives in his agency have filed a whistleblower lawsuit against him, alleging crimes of bribery, corruption, and abuse of office. And these are some of the most outstanding Christian conservative constitutional attorneys you'll find in the country, Jeff Mateer, among others. And so we need to restore that trust, not only among Texans and law enforcement officials, but among members of the Texas bar, to then serve causes greater than self, rejoin this agency, take on these big issues, do it with lesser pay. But I have that proven track record doing that in the private sector as land commissioner here in Austin. And so I feel like the next Attorney General needs to be a chief recruiter for legal talent throughout the country.
Gotcha. And I want to get back to some of the actions you've taken as commissioner later, but recently Governor Greg Abbott said he thought the first Latino governor of Texas would be a Republican and that he or she would be elected soon. Do you think that you might be the one to pick up that mantle?
Well, I'm not one to talk about political future. I mean, to be honest with you, I've been now in my month 9 of this campaign, and my wife and kids may have something else to say about future campaigns. I'm focused on this one right here, right now. But I do agree with the point that the governor makes, that for the Republican Party to succeed, we've got to continue that message. And I would never advocate changing our conservative ideas or positions to get votes like the left does, to politically appeal shamelessly to get votes. I believe the conservative message succeeds in Texas. And so when you look at March 1 in my primary, I actually carried a lot of those counties south of San Antonio, heading towards the border, from Cameron County, Hidalgo County, Star over to Webb and Laredo. And it's because of border insecurity and spending a lot of time in the community communicating in Spanish and English conservative ideas. And so I've always believed, the entirety of my public service has been behind this idea that the Hispanic community is naturally philosophically aligned with the conservative movement. We just need good leaders that can communicate that and make it real and practical for voters to understand.
And you mentioned that you've carried some of these border districts, and in Florida as well, the GOP has seen success in growing the share of the Latino vote. What do you think is the main driver of this, and do you think it can continue nationally?
So I mentioned border insecurity being a top issue. Look, I'm the son of a legal immigrant. My mother went through the process, and there are millions of legal immigrants in the state of Texas that millions of Texans that know somebody or related to somebody that went through the legal process as well, but they're tired of people cutting through line. I mean, I was just reading the report that in the month of January, the amount of apprehensions over 175,000 with an additional 100,000 that also crossed undetected. And so we're looking at another year of over 2 million encounters with 1 million, quote, gotaways on top of last year's record amount. So, a lot of legal immigrants are offended by that. And so, it makes for good politics for Republicans, but it's bad policy for our country. I'll also say that Latinos by nature, we're very conservative socially. We believe in pro-life. We believe that the Second Amendment can protect the First Amendment. And we believe that entrepreneurship and small businesses are the way forward economically for a lot of our communities. And so, again, that aligns naturally with the Republican Party, but for far too long, we haven't had enough of an effort to reach out to the fastest growing community, at least in our state, of 29 million people, now about to cross 30 million, with this already being a majority minority state, about to be majority Hispanic in the next decades. So this requires a renewed sense of energy, leadership, whether it's in our party or candidates like myself, to continue hitting the blocks, speaking in Spanish, platicando con la gente, but doing so in conservative tones, and reminding them why our state is so prosperous. It's because of limited government leadership.
Gotcha. And so let's talk a little bit about some of those issues that you've raised. Immigration and the border, you've taken a strong stance on. Like you said, you sued the Biden administration from your position for halting the border wall. You also authorized construction of a state-funded border wall. What actions would you take on the wall specifically and on border security more generally as Attorney General?
So as Attorney General, I would carry on that litigation from day one. I would also forward deploy a mobile prosecution unit. So in Texas, sadly, Ken has lost every area of original jurisdiction available to his office under criminal law in the state of Texas, meaning he cannot bring criminal trespassing claims unilaterally in border communities in Texas. And so I'm the only candidate in this race that would actually take and has proposed every available resource we would have in the agency to forward deploy, much like what we've done with our National Guard, in excess of 12,000 guardsmen that are now keeping the watch. We haven't made that commitment legally in the state of Texas. Additionally, I would also be sending paralegals and lawyers to sign easements with private ranchers and farmers, because people forget most of the border lands are owned not by the state of Texas, but privately. And so that requires easements to be drafted with private owners to allow for the continued construction of the Texas wall. Secondly, I would also be drafting affidavits with farmers, ranchers to allow for Border Patrol, county, and local law enforcement to be able to interdict, apprehend, and detain illegal immigrants under state criminal trespassing law. We cannot enforce federal immigration law, but to have those affidavits and to have that legal support there would incredibly enhance the ability for local law enforcement to do their job. And then finally, I would be an advocate in the legislature. We've appropriated a historic amount of an additional $1 billion to help with border security, with wall construction. But we have an AG that's facing his own felony counts in a Harris County court and an FBI investigation. So he can't claim the moral high ground on issues of criminality in the legislature because there is no trust there. So the legislature is going to be holding the keys to the bank to help fund this, knowing that Joe Biden isn't going to do his job for the next 3 years on this issue and turn a blind eye to the national security issue that confronts us down here in Texas.
And you said you would work to apprehend border crossers. Would you attempt to deport any and all border crossers, or would you make exceptions for asylum seekers, or how would that process work?
So since we can't enforce federal immigration law, we would not contain the ability to deport. But what I do advocate is a deputization program. It obviously would require the Biden administration to help us out here, but to allow for ICE and Border Patrol to train or even second officials to embed themselves with local law enforcement and state troopers so that we can arrest and deport pursuant to federal immigration protocols. Right now, if we were to detain, we can refer an illegal immigrant to federal authorities so that they can leverage Title 42 to deport, or other mechanisms available to them to deport. At the federal level, as Attorney General, I'll work with the congressional delegation to close the loopholes. The biggest glaring loophole that Border Patrol briefs me on is our asylum loopholes, which basically allows for somebody to claim an asylum proceeding if they come from a country other than Mexico, largely speaking from Central America. And that's creating one of the largest loopholes that we're seeing in the surges. If we can continue to keep the Remain in Mexico policy on the books, that would do so much to help our local law enforcement and our Border Patrol. But to answer your question, the governor's Operation Lone Star effort to arrest under criminal trespassing claims is a deterrent. We're hearing that from coyotes, from smugglers that are later apprehended, that if they know that they're going to be arrested and detained, regardless, even if they're encountered by a local law enforcement official, that is a deterrent, more so than even being detained by a Border Patrol official, because they know that all they have to do is claim asylum and be caught and released and blend into the shadows, because we're finding less than half of asylum claims are actually showing up before an immigration judge, on average 3 years after they get detained at our border. So we've created a system that incentivizes illegal immigration. I think the Texas process is actually showing a deterrent that you will be arrested under criminal trespassing laws and you will be detained.
And do you think that these sort of laws are going to decrease illegal immigration through Texas, and might it actually push illegal immigration towards other border states, Arizona, New Mexico, California?
We have seen that. We have heard that from Border Patrol officials, and not to get too much into intelligence briefings, but you know, the fact is border cartels, the smugglers, are counter surveilling all of our assets on our own border. And they know exactly the weakest points by which they can place pressure with illegal migrant caravans. And then that provides an opportunity for them to smuggle fentanyl and narcotics. So for them, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. All they have to do is place pressure in certain areas of our border and then take advantage of the weaker areas of our border. So, and they do know that Texas is going to be more aggressive on this than other states. I mean, that's the reality. And so it'll place pressure on others. But as an elected official in the state of Texas, I got to do what I possibly can to protect our own resources and our own people and our own communities. But we can lock arms with, say, the Attorney General in Arizona, Mark Bronovich, who drafted an advisory opinion, which I support, and I would have drafted a long time ago as the Texas Attorney General, that asserts the state of Texas' own sovereignty, as Arizona has under Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution, that pretty clearly states that that the federal government has the obligation to protect states from invasion. In this case, being non-state actors like bloody drug cartels that are placing pressure on our border, and for states giving them the authority to assert their own sovereignty, and to whether it's to build their own wall, whether it's to send down National Guardsmen, or to have the legislature revisit their own laws, criminally speaking, to address the situation. And so, you know, this is a time in a crisis. I know Ukraine is grabbing the headlines, but this is our big issue, and we've got to address it head on.
Gotcha. And so the Texas legislature has also had a pretty blockbuster year for passing laws. So you're going to have a busy docket, and I wanted to kind of look at a couple of them. One was an overhaul of the election and voting rules in the state. And part of that law required that mail-in ballots provide either a social security number or a driver's license number. that had to match what voters submitted when they registered to vote. And if they forgot which one they used and switched up their driver's license and social security, their ballot could be rejected. So in the first round of your primary, 13% of mail-in ballots were rejected compared to about 1% in 2020. Do you worry that these changes specifically have made it harder for every legal vote to be counted and might undermine election integrity?
So taking a step back, when we as a legislature, visited during the special session, the Democrats left their job and refused to sit at the crafting table for this important law, because constituents in Texas in the wake of 2020 were very clear that they wanted to make it more secure and have more integrity in our voting process. This is the most important constitutional responsibility I believe that we all have. And as the legislature in representing the will of the people, they came forward with very common sense measures, including the measure that you had referred to, and that's actually just requiring basic information on a mail-in ballot. There's going to be changes and there's going to be some confusion, but I believe, and as Attorney General, I would back that law in any court. And the reason is very simple, that we just need to make sure that there is no impropriety. There should never be any questions, Republican or Democrat, on either side of whether or not an election is being held freely and fairly. And so the fact is that counties, when counting ballots, have a lot of authorities, a lot of areas of misinterpretation, in my opinion, under our election law system. So to make it unambiguous in terms of what the requirements were is perhaps something we can all do better in terms of communicating to the public in terms of how you fill in that mail-in ballot. But there's also improprieties and on that same night in Harris County that showed that they forgot to count thousands of ballots as well. So drafting good law to create secure and fair elections is important, but execution, I believe, is just as important. And that pressure falls on counties to do their job, including in Harris County. And so one of my proposals as the next Attorney General is to not only work with the Secretary of State to make sure that the administration of elections are fair, but to amp up the criminal investigative capabilities of the agency to make sure that we're doing the right thing. And right now we only have a handful of prosecutors in a state of 30 million in 254 counties. I would not advocate a special prosecutor in every single county, but we certainly do need more criminal investigative and more prosecutorial capabilities to help counties make sure that there is no impropriety, whether it's mail-in, whether it's drive-through, which was an attempt, ballot harvesting, which is another harmful way in which people are trying to manipulate the system. And
so it sounds like you're advocating more resources, but your opponent as Attorney General spent 22,000 hours of taxpayer time looking for voter fraud and found 16 cases out of 17 million registered voters. You've talked about that you want to eliminate wasteful government spending. Don't you think that increasing this support is going to be wasting taxpayer resources on something that really there has not been evidence for?
So what that statistic shows me is that we don't have good management, leadership at the top to basically get more with less, if that makes sense. So to basically have that amount of hours invested in resulting in so few crimes, because he does try to say, well, I have dozens of cases pending, and that's incorrect. He has multiple counts per each individual. But a good manager would make sure that we're getting more of a return on investment from the hours invested. And also, to be clear, in terms of investigative capabilities, doesn't necessarily mean that every new investigator we bring in is exclusively focused on voting fraud. There's certainly other areas that investigative capability can help us out on, whether it's human trafficking, capital crimes, or other forms of violent crime that we're finding that a lot of county DAs and sheriffs just don't have that capability to be of assistance with. And the fact is the AG can take on more complicated criminal cases that has been neglected. And unfortunately, a lot of those capabilities have been stripped by the legislature because of the lack of trust in Ken. So, we can't just sit back in an ivory tower and just wait for the next area of crime to develop in Texas. We need to be able to anticipate that whether it's the paper tag crisis that just presented itself in our state capitol, where the black market now is profiting wildly off of printing paper tags in Texas on a temporary basis, where a lot of criminal defendants actually are circumventing our DMV processes. So all to say that we need somebody that's at the top that's more responsive to the issues on the street.
So I think, like you mentioned, trafficking is one of the big issues. How do you plan to cut down on fentanyl trafficking and human trafficking, other than, as you mentioned, resources at the border?
So people forget a lot of human trafficking actually is domestically groomed, meaning that the chain of events that lead to a young woman or a young man being forced into labor actually occurs predominantly domestically. The border insecurity issue does play into this as well, and I've already visited on that. But I think domestically, we need a better job of, again, of investigative capability that can help source the evidence to prosecute and put away these criminals for a long time. The reality is that in Ken's time, I believe the stat is in the last 2 years, he's convicted approximately 4 human traffickers, which is not enough. I've been told that this is the fastest growing crime in the state of Texas. About 250,000 acts of the sex trade alone, that doesn't include forced labor, occur in our state on an annual basis. And the Attorney General has lost this area of original jurisdiction to bring these claims. So on day one, I'm going to go into the halls of power, into our legislature, and ask for that original area of jurisdiction. I will call all the major county DAs and say, we need to work together, refer each other to cases. I want to be in the courthouse with you to the extent I can be helpful to you on these cases. We need enhanced criminal sentencing. In Texas, we treat pimps and johns very lightly. It is now a felony to purchase sex. So as of the last legislative session, we've enhanced that. But in terms of sentencing, we can always look at increasing and getting tough. And johns and pimps and perps are going to awaken to that. Finally, I would also say that we know where the hubs of this trade occur, predominantly strip clubs and massage parlors. This last session, I worked on a bill called the SMART Act. In fact, I visited with a trafficking survivor this morning and working with her to help pass this bill, raising the age by which people can work in sexually oriented businesses in Texas to 21 from 18. Louisiana passed this law just a few years ago. And they've seen a significant decrease in the amount of sexual assault among strippers, and also known acts of the sex trade occurring in strip clubs in Louisiana. So why aren't we having, a chief prosecutor who's bringing the fight to these folks, continue to put pressure on our Department of Licensing and Regulation to take the fight to massage parlors, and just getting tough? I don't know why we've gone so soft in this.
And I want to quickly hit on a couple of the other laws that Texas has passed. One was they expanded low-dose medical THC use, but Texas still remains a very restrictive state for marijuana laws. Most Americans support full legalization of marijuana. Only 10% of Texans still think it should be totally illegal. Would you support relaxing enforcement of marijuana laws, or advocating for marijuana legalization, or at least legalization of medical marijuana?
I'm good with where we're at right now in Texas. My focus is going to be enforcing the laws on the books. I will challenge city measures that try to liberalize this issue. People forget that, and I'm a parent of 2 boys who are 8 and 6, that, cerebral development continues throughout most of your teenage years through the middle ages of your 20 years. And so all to say that, there's a lot of science left out there on this issue, and that it's something that I'll allow for the legislature to debate and litigate, but I'm not going to advocate for liberalizing. I'll also say that, we need to also focus on kind of the, in my visits with county sheriffs throughout the state of Texas, they tell me that we need to pledge resources towards the true issue here, and that's fentanyl and narcotics that are creating a sense of dependency and resulting in violent crime on our streets. And so I would support the continuation of drug courts in Texas, because they've actually shown to provide a lower recidivism rate among criminality. As the head of Veterans Affairs in the state of Texas, I've supported the Veterans Court system in Texas, and this allows for first-time offenders to take a diversionary path away from adjudicating that claim as long as they join a treatment center, whether it's for alcohol or for drugs. And so if we can approach things for first-time offenders more therapeutically rather than just criminally, then that could be a change by which we get people through a treatment process, because that if you care about judicial economy and cost effectiveness, that could end up being a better process for Texans moving forward.
And if the federal government did legalize marijuana, would you fight that order, or would you be accepting of marijuana being legalized throughout the country?
That would be something that I'd have to determine at the time, depending on whether or not the legislature has a law that triggers either acceptance of that, which we have done. We've drafted several trigger laws in other areas of law, or if it's a congressional act that overnight changes the law. And then responding to what the legislature does, because my role will be defending what the legislature does in response to that. And so I'd hate to project on that, but as I mentioned before, I wouldn't be for liberalizing what we have on the books, because I feel like right now Texas has a good model. And again, that's why I'm a Federalist, because to allow other states to see from their experiences what is doing well and what's not doing well, whether it's in Colorado and their additional revenue generation, but also the downside of what you see sometimes among the homelessness in the streets of Denver. So just approaching this thoughtfully, patiently, there's no rush, and understanding what the facts and circumstances are at the time to make that decision.
Gotcha. And one other, not a law, but Governor Greg Abbott recently had an order that gender affirming care be investigated as child abuse, and it was then blocked as unconstitutional by a district judge. So your opponent has voiced his support for this controversial order. A lot of civil rights groups and those in the business community have rejected it. Would you support the governor's order, and would you appeal the judge's decision, or are you not supportive of this order?
No, I would support the order. I'd continue the litigation. I would appeal the district court. Look, I'm pro-life. I believe that we're made in God's image, and that as it relates to minors in Texas, that this behavior should be considered child abuse. My opponent, regretfully, has accepted a fair amount of capital, campaign cash, from the two political action committees that support this industry in Texas. And so I've been very clear on it. As an adult, I think there's different legal issues that apply, but as it relates to minors and as it relates to the order under the DFPS, our Family Protective Services, for minors in Texas, that this is a problematic industry and something that we need to be fearful of in Texas.
And you don't worry that it might be hypocritical if Republicans are pushing for a parental bill of rights to also be policing how parents are raising their children?
Well, I'm not familiar with that Bill of Rights, but I do know of an instance in Fort Worth where a non-custodial parent, against his will, had a 9-year-old child led through transition by the custodial parent. And that's the area that I've been focusing on this issue, is because the AG does have oversight over areas of family law, is making sure that both parents have input in terms of the decision for their children. But as it relates to abuse and leading through the transition process, I'm against it. And I would, as it relates to this particular case that's been brought, would continue that litigation.
And it seems like we're getting close to wrapping up here. So I just want to sort of close out and ask you why you think you're the right person for the Republicans to nominate as the candidate for Texas Attorney General.
Well, I have the necessary experience to do this job. Texas is facing transformational challenges from the federal government, but also from mayors and county judges that are standing up to directives of freedom. I want to work to secure the border, leveraging my national security background in the military, confronting gangs like MS-13. I want to back our law enforcement officials who regretfully have not gotten the pay or the resources necessary to do their jobs at a very challenging time in cities like Houston with an escalating rate of homicides. We need somebody who's going to confront fraud, whether that's consumer, whether that's voting fraud or public corruption. And that starts from the top. Leadership has to be committed to this, has to honor the vows that we make to our wives, to our churches, our synagogues, and to the Constitution. And regretfully, our current Attorney General has not done that. He's literally cheated at everything in his life, whether it was stealing Montblanc pens out of a county courthouse or refusing to sit down for a jury trial for 3 felony counts, securities fraud in Houston. We need somebody that's going to hit the reset button, beat the Democrats, and make sure that we keep our state the greatest state and the greatest country the world has ever seen.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us and speaking about these issues, and good luck with the rest of your campaign.
Thank you for your time. Thanks for having me.